Articulating Learning Objectives, Course Design Essentials from the Columbia University Center for Teaching and Learning. Welcome to this video series on course design. What you will learn here will help you design or redesign a course for your teaching context and mode of delivery. This video presents the what, why, and how of learning objectives and reflection questions to guide your drafting process. Recall from the previous video that the first stage of the backward design framework is to identify desired results, that is, to design a course with the end in mind. Similarly, in Fink's framework for integrated course design, instructors are encouraged to articulate learning goals. Goals describe broadly what you want students to learn, whereas learning objectives describe the specific behaviors and performances that demonstrate student learning and skill development. They articulate the cognitive processes or skills that students should master by the end of the course. In Stage 1, we clarify priorities and identify the cognitive processes and the types of knowledge we want our students to gain. The question we ask is, what should students know, understand, and be able to do? Why do we need course learning objectives? They help focus our planning and guide purposeful action toward intended results. Learning objectives benefit both instructors and students. For instructors, they guide course design decisions, they help determine the types of assessments or acceptable evidence of student learning, the learning activities that will help students achieve the learning objectives, they help in the selection and organization of course content, and determine instructional strategies. For students, course learning objectives provide a roadmap, manage expectations, and help to focus their efforts and monitor their progress. Common mistakes when drafting learning objectives include that the learning objectives are not objectives, just the list of the content that students will learn in a course. Instructors often think about what they want to accomplish in a course, what topics they want to cover. In this case, objectives may be instructor or content-centered and not focus on what the students will be able to do. In certain instances, objectives may not be achievable given the level and time frame of the course, or they may be vague and not measurable. As in the case of this example, students will understand the laws of thermodynamics, or students will gain an appreciation for classic texts. More specifically, what would students do to demonstrate their understanding or their appreciation? What does understanding of the laws of thermodynamics look like? These objectives can be clarified by asking, what would students do differently if they really understand or appreciate? In Understanding by Design, Wiggins and McTighe articulate that when we truly understand, we are able to explain, interpret, apply, have perspective, empathize, and have metacognitive awareness, ultimately making the learning meaningful, able to see the big picture of the course, and to deploy knowledge and skills. Similarly, Fink's taxonomy of significant learning takes a holistic approach to learning goals or learning experiences, encouraging instructors to determine the appropriateness and relevance of 6 types of goals which interact with one another. This taxonomy helps us think beyond what course goals commonly focus on, foundational knowledge and application, expanding our thinking about our courses and the role they play in integrating human dimensions, caring, and student development of metacognitive skills critical for lifelong learning. To get started, Fink encourages instructors to ask themselves, what would you like the impact of your course to be on students 2 to 3 years after the course is over? What should distinguish students who have taken this course from those who have not? These questions guide us to identify curricular priorities. What knowledge and skills will students learn in your course? Prior to drafting learning objectives, consider the idea, concept, and skill priorities for your course. What key information and ideas are important for students to understand in your course? What kinds of thinking are important for students to learn? What important skills do students need to gain? Reflecting on these questions help us move away from focusing on all the possible content that can be included in a course. Wiggins and McTighe remind us that there is a universe of possible content. However, it cannot all be addressed in a course or unit of study. Though we should certainly identify all that students should encounter in our courses, the things they should hear, read, view, research, the things they should be familiar with, our focus will be on what is important to know and do. What transferable knowledge and skills do our students need? Ultimately, we want to reach the core of the course, that is, identify the big ideas and core tasks that anchor the course. Drilling down to this core helps identify our priorities for teaching and learning. As you embark on drafting course learning objectives, let's explore their characteristics. Learning objectives should be student-centered, focusing on what learners will be able to do. Learning objectives should be specific, specifying the knowledge students will acquire and breaking down the task or the component part of a skill. For instance, writing is a general skill, but it can be broken down to identifying an argument, organizing, and selecting appropriate evidence. Learning objectives should be action-driven, containing an action verb that refers to the intended cognitive processes. Learning objectives should be observable and measurable. This guides the selection of assessment to provide evidence that the learning objective has been achieved. And finally, the learning objective should be achievable given the learner, the course context, and the course duration. Learning objectives commonly precede the sentence stem. By the end of the course, students will be able to. Let's look at a few examples of learning objectives. For a history course, students will be able to articulate and debunk common myths about Mexican immigration. For a statistics course, students will be able to discuss features and limitations of various sampling procedures and research methodologies. For an engineering course, students will be able to analyze simple circuits that include resistors and capacitors. Notice how each learning objective focuses on what students will be able to do, contains an action verb, and is specific enough to be measurable. How does one draft learning objectives? Building on the priorities identified earlier, instructors can use the taxonomy of educational objectives created by Benjamin Bloom in 1956 and revised by Anderson et al. In 2001 to determine the action verb for a learning objective. Bloom's taxonomy represents 6 levels of intellectual behavior, from simple recall of facts to complex creation of knowledge. At the remember level, students are able to recognize, recall, or retrieve knowledge from long-term memory. Action verbs include describe, define, identify, list, name, repeat, state. At the understand level, students are able to construct meaning from what they have been taught. Action verbs include classify, discuss, explain, identify, paraphrase, relate, summarize, translate. At the applied level, students are able to carry out or use a procedure in a given situation. Action verbs include calculate, determine, execute, illustrate, implement, model, practice, sketch, solve. At the analyzed level, students are able to break material into its component parts and determine how the parts relate to one another and to an overall structure or purpose. Action verbs include differentiate, organize, relate, compare, contrast, distinguish, examine, experiment, question, test. At the evaluate level, students are able to make judgments based on criteria and standards. Action verbs include appraise, argue, critique, defend, judge, measure, prove, select, support, value. At the create level, students are able to put elements together to form a coherent or functional whole. Action verbs include adapt, build, compile, construct, design, formulate, generate, invent, plan, produce, propose, transform. What are your course learning objectives? What levels of the revised Bloom's taxonomy will you draw on? Let's recap. In this video, we focused our attention on stage 1 of backward design. To articulate learning objectives, we must first clarify our curricular priorities, the core knowledge and skills that students will acquire and develop in the course. As you draft, complete the sentence stem. By the end of the course, students will be able to, and review each learning objective to ensure that it is student-centered, specific, includes an action verb from the revised Bloom's taxonomy, measurable, and achievable. As a reminder, be sure to communicate the learning objectives to your students. Once you have clearly stated your learning objectives for your course, assignments, and modules or units of study, communicate these to your students in writing, on the syllabus, in the introduction to an online module or assignment instructions, and orally using language that is accessible to your students. We want students to understand the objectives and how each objective is central to the course and their development. This concludes articulating learning objectives. Please view the other videos to explore each stage of course design in more detail. For course design or redesign assistance and other teaching and learning support, please contact the CTL at columbiactl@columbia.edu.